Thank you. Awesome. Well, I'm super excited to talk to you today about creating animated charts with D3 and React hooks. But first, a little bit about myself. So I'm a dual US and Polish citizen. Both countries are very close to my heart. I was born and raised in New Jersey, but for the past almost 2 years, I've been living in Poland and loving life in Poland. So I'm a front-end developer at a software company called NetGuru in Warsaw. And also a very big part of my life is everything and everything outdoors. But the most relevant to this presentation is that I proudly consider myself to be a lifelong learner. So whether that's taking up Muay Thai boxing last year, or going canyoning in the Alps this past May, or learning to surf 2 weeks ago, or becoming a programmer. I have no fun pictures of me sitting in front of a computer coding, but maybe one day I will. And so when it comes to programming, my journey really began in college when I was a research assistant tasked with showing some data. So the professor I was working with gave me a bunch of previous reports that basically had graphics very similar to what you see here, and I was bored just looking at them. So not even knowing what the data was supposed to represent, I knew that there had to be a better way. And so luckily, I was thinking out loud and happened to have a roommate studying computer science at the time who pointed me in the direction of this site, D3, Data-Driven Documents. So for those of you unfamiliar with D3, it's basically one of, if not the most popular data visualization libraries in JavaScript. It's flexible, it has a strong community, and basically I like to think of it as drawing with data. So the possibilities are endless, as you can see just from their home screen and all of the intricate examples. And so my journey with programming really began in a backwards way because I knew D3 before I knew what HTML or CSS was. So since then, I've been hooked on D3, and today I'm hooked on D3 and React together. So what I want to chat today about is React is the data visualization library D3, but I'll also be sharing a bit of secrets about the art of cooking at a 5-star restaurant. So you might be a little confused now, but just keep that in mind as we go forward. But before we jump right into what the title of this presentation promised, which was creating animated charts with D3 and React hooks, I think we need to take a little step back and focus on one word in particular, and that being animated. So what is animation really but time and change, or to be more precise, change over time. So it's about transformation, it's about transition. It's basically a simple concept, but it can be applied in many ways and be very powerful. So in terms of that, why do we animate? Well, there's several types of value that it can add, or several situations that it can add value in. So for example, to communicate continuity. So it provides a visual cue that we don't have two separate objects, we have one object transitioning over time. Another situation where it can add value is when we have a reaction to a given user action. So in this case, it's a communication of cause and effect, that if we do something and something else happens, we know that there was a relationship with what happened and what we made make that happen. And related to that is a communication of motion. So this is just a clue that something is happening. So for example, a loading component should signal to the user that something else is happening in the background. So in essence, what animation really provides is more information. It's not just the snapshots of reality, but their collection. But the beauty is that it does this with less to process at one given time. So for example, without animation, we see that we have two separate objects, a smaller blue dot and a larger orange dot. With animation, our eyes just need to focus on that one object, and it's no longer about just this first state and the second state, but it's about the relationship between the states. And so then, how does this apply to data visualization? Well, I like to think about it in terms of salt and spices. So salt and spices really represent two different approaches to applying animation in data visualizations. And just like the balance of salt and spices wins out in the long run when it comes to cooking, the same is true for how and when to animate charts as well. And so what do I mean? Well, salt really enhances the underlying elements. It doesn't overshadow them or it doesn't overpower them. Spices, on the other hand, change the flavor profile. So they bring your senses to different elements or different features. And so when it comes to data visualization, it's really a combination of the salt and spices that we want to add. We want to maintain focus, which is the salt, and redirect focus, which is the spices, in an appropriate manner. And so the trick here isn't just to add the salt and add the spices, but to add them where they are appropriate. And so when do we add the salt and spices? Well, this is our first situation that would clue that we can add animation to this data visualization. This is when we're replacing data sets. So data set A, the blue data set, right now is being replaced by data set B, the green data set. And so we have elements entering and exiting, and we need to clue to the user that the entire set is changing. So without animation here, and say the colors were the same, if the user didn't see that change, then they might think it's the same data set. The second example is an example of a salt animation. So here we're not changing data sets, but we're just changing the values of the particular elements within that data set. So this is a transition that maintains our focus on the specific elements. Similar to that is when we have time series data. So this is also elements that are changing a particular value over time. So in this case, a line chart animating over time. You could think of real-time data where this is particularly important. We want to maintain the focus and show that it's a continuation. And the last example I have here is an example of a spices animation, so redirecting focus. And this is what I like to call direct redirection. So it's using animation as a form of narration or storytelling or explaining to user where you want their eye to go. So for example here, we could be directing focus to this one dot that seems to be an outlier in the linear pattern that we see. So if we know that animation can add value in certain situations in data visualizations, it would probably also be helpful to know exactly how to implement that. And so this is where our two cooks come in. But have you ever heard the saying that you can't have too many cooks in the kitchen? Well, it's an English saying, but I think it makes sense in a global context, right? So how can you have one pot, one knife, one cutting board, one set of ingredients, and expect two different cooks to create one unified dish? So it would be very hard to do. And this is exactly the situation that we have when we try to use React and D3 together. So those are our two cooks, React and D3, and they both want to be in charge of one kitchen, which in this case is the DOM. So D3 wants to make changes to the real DOM and React to the virtual DOM. And so the issue here is really about DOM management. And there's three main ways that this situation could play out. So let's take a look at the first option. This is where our first cook, React, will take control. So this is the classic React that we know and love, but we're just using D3 as a utility library, so for certain calculations. So we start with setup here. We have width, height, and data coming from our props, and we're using D3 to set our scales. So this is basically the format of setting up scales with D3. You have different functions. We're using a scale band to set up the x-axis and scale linear for the y-axis. But that's the only piece we're using D3 here. Then we render an SVG container, which is what we need to have our visualization in, provide it with the width and height, and append our bars to it. And so this gives us a visualization of sorts, but we miss all of the animation magic that we just talked about. So we don't have transitions between the states here. So if we want that transition power, let's take a look at the second option. So this is when our second cook, D3, will take control of the kitchen. So this method is a bit more involved, and it uses D3's enter, update, exit pattern, which you can read more about in their very detailed documentation. So let's take a look here. Basically, we start out with a class component. In this case, we have component did mount, component did update. We have a draw function and render. So what we're rendering here is, again, our SVG container, but here we're providing a ref that later D3 will use to select the space where it can make its updates in. And we have the draw function, which is the bulk of this component, and where D3 will take control. So within this draw function, we're setting up the scales based on the width and height and the data. And here, D3 is also going to be selecting that space, that SVG container to draw in, and making spaces for each of the rectangles that will be appending in the future by attaching them to data. So right now, we just have empty spaces. We have 5 empty spaces where we want to append rectangles. And the next piece is to select those empty spaces and actually append our elements in. So here, D3 is adding to our DOM. And here, we can add transitions in simply by using this keyword, this key method called transition. We provide it with a duration and then the end values that we want. So here, we're setting up the X and Y positions, and the width and height, and the color. Color didn't have to be where it is. It could have been above transition because we're not changing it in this case. But let's take a look at what we get here. And it's much nicer. It's a smooth transition, and our eye can focus on each of the bars in particular. Oh, but I didn't finish. So D3 also, that enter, update, exit pattern will exit out elements, those spaces that are no longer necessary. So say we have a data set that has six elements and then changes to a data set that has 5, we'll remove that extra space so that we can just show the visualization with the 5 spaces. And we run the draw function on mount and whenever our props, in this case, data update. So you saw the effect of all of this, but as you could also see, it's a little more complicated. It's not the general React that we're used to. And so basically, if we want something in between those two, we want the transition power of D3, but sort of the simplicity of understanding the renders of React, then let's take a look at this third option where the 2 cooks will share control. So again, we have those 4 methods, we're going to be rendering our SVG container, again, providing it with a ref. But in this situation, React will already be mapping our data to SVG rectangle elements in this case. So we're mapping it to rectangles, but we're not providing it with any additional values such as the X or Y attributes, the width or the height. D3 will take care of that in the draw function. So again, we define the scales as we have seen in the other examples. And here we're grabbing the SVG space and all of the rectangles that React has already created for us. So again, you see this transition being added in, but without the appending rectangles or the exiting spaces that are no longer necessary. And the last piece is to just call that draw function on mount and whenever our props update. And we get the same nice and smooth example. So we're improving. But there's a difference between working together and working together in a straightforward, predictable, organized manner that's pleasing to look at and pleasing to write. So this is where hooks come in. So in this example, the chef, React, will tell our sous chef, D3, when it needs his or her help, and then gives it free rein to work its magic. So it's just a change of mindset. It's no longer the two cooks, but it's a chef and a sous chef that will be having clear communication about their collaboration. So here we're especially going to be taking a look at the useRef and useEffect hooks. And we get to have a functional component to use those hooks. So the first piece is to use ref to reference our SVG container. And then within the draw function, the only difference here compared to the example before is that we'll be selecting svgref.current because that's what the useRef hook returns us to select that actual element. And instead of having component did mount and component did update, we'll be using a useEffect hook to update our visualization whenever the data, in this case, changes. And so, again, we get the same result, but in a much cleaner format. So it's pleasing to look at and it's pleasing to create. But the beauty of this pattern is that it works for simple and complex or more complex visualizations alike. So this one is like one step more complex because here we'll be having bars coming in and points coming in. So this is an example that I called the non-boring keyboard. I don't know, it might be boring, but I thought bored and boring make sense together, so I like the title because of that. And so the inspiration for this visualization was basically, why is the keyboard laid out the way it is, the QWERTY keyboard? It's the same across a lot of languages, which languages themselves are very different. And so I wanted to take a look at the distribution of typing on this keyboard. Does it make sense? Because the keys should be further apart if they're used in combination. And so what we want out of this visualization is that when I type something in, we see bars coming up below to bring the eye to this specific location where I'm typing, to the specific letter. I'm just going to be typing random letters now. And then we have points coming in, which will basically be forming our distribution. So we could take a look at what that distribution looks like. And then we also have a few other user actions that will trigger animations. So we can change the x-axis to be alphabetical if we want to look at the alphabetical layout. Or we could change the y-axis, condense it basically so that we're just looking at a count, looking at the frequency of letters used versus the distribution itself. And so we have a few things going on, and let's take a look at how our chef and sous chef would handle a challenge like this. So we begin with the chef, React, who will prep our pot. So here he's going to be using the useref hook, again, to set up our SVG container, to set up a reference on that. And then also setting the dimensions. So the dimensions could have come from outside this component, but I just included them here. And so again, we see that our SVG has a ref. Next, the chef, React, will set up our recipe. So in this case, our recipe is our data. Right now, we're holding it in a use state hook. So we added another hook in this example. Because we're getting user input that's just raw input, and within this component, we're manipulating that, we're cleaning it up to get just the points data that we want. And the chef is going to define our proportions. So how do we want to map that recipe to reality, to concrete elements? So this is where the scales come in. Here, I'm holding them in an object. So the first two we see here are our point scales for those scatter plots. But below, we also have the bar chart scales and a color scale. So D3 is very powerful when it comes to those calculations. And the last piece for our chef right now is to map those, that recipe to concrete ingredients. So here we have our bar data being mapped to SVG rectangle elements, and our points data being mapped to SVG circle elements. And the chef, of course, needs a way to tell the sous chef when he can step in. So he already knows where he can step in because he set up the useRef hook. But our useEffect hook in this situation is telling our sous chef, D3, that, okay, whenever the points data updates, I want you to update the scatter plot and update the bar chart. So he can provide additional information, such as this happened on a key press. And then our sous chef, D3, will know exactly what to do in that situation. So here we're using a switch statement that basically has the different commands that our sous chef can get from our chef React. So in this case, for the case of key press, the sous chef D3 will select the space that it needs and introduce that transition. So here we have sort of a double transition. This is the bars that we're talking about. So we're making them appear, and then we're making them disappear. And it's easy to sort of layer on the transitions with D3 simply by adding another transition keyword. And we're going to repeat this pattern for the other transitions. So in this case, when the user toggles the X scale from alphabetic to QWERTY or QWERTY to alphabetic on the button click, our chef, React, will tell our sous chef, D3, that, okay, whenever the X-axis type changes, I want you to update the scatter plot and update the bar chart. And then in this case, I'm providing you with the information that this was of type X-axis. And of course, our sous chef, D3, knows exactly what to do in this case. He again selects where he wants to make those edits, introduce those transitions, and does so. So here we're just changing the X attribute. And so it works. Yay. Thank you. So they created a unified dish. And just to recap what we talked about here is first in terms of our salt and our spices. So salt is about animations that call for maintaining the user's focus in certain locations. So it's for changes within a piece of data. You can think of elements that have the same key, but a different value. Our spices animation are for changes based on redirecting the user's focus. So perhaps when something was added or removed from the data set, whenever our data set changes. I need to stop doing that. And we talked about who can add those salt and spices into our animation. So in this case, our chef will use especially the useRef and useEffect hooks to tell our sous chef, D3, when and where exactly to make those changes. Our sous chef will then take his action within that update or draw function. And so to close, I wanted to leave you with a few takeaways that apply to code as well as cooking. And so the first is let the ingredients speak, don't speak for them. So I think there's a wrong approach and a right approach when it comes to cooking and to applying animation to data visualization. So the wrong approach would be, what do we want to add? So it's about us, it's not about the ingredients or the data. And then there's the right approach, what is this dish calling for? Or what is this data calling for? What animation does it lend itself to? Next takeaway, don't have too many cooks in the kitchen. We talked about this one in depth. A chef and a sous chef with clear delineation of responsibilities work much better together. And the last sort of takeout is that cooking isn't baking. So baking is really about using exact proportions. There's not much room for creativity if you're following a recipe, whereas cooking is about using patterns and understanding the tools you have to work with. So if you take a look online, there's a lot of different methods for integrating React and D3, and this is just one approach that I found works for me. So it's more like cooking, not baking. And with that, the only thing I have to add is that I'll be putting these slides online later, and I wish you happy visualizing and bon appetit.